Just a second. Well, good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure for me to return to the NIAS after a gap of more than 2 years, albeit under somewhat abnormal virtual circumstances that may in fact be a sign of our times as a new normal. Thank you, Professor Mail Vaganan, for the invitation, and I'm glad to see Professor Nagappa in the audience as well. As a past practitioner of diplomacy rather than a scholar, it is refreshing to speak to an informed academic audience on a major yet still unfolding political, economic, health, and existential phenomenon, even more so in the presence of 3 distinguished scholars on the Indo-Pacific. More than my own talk, I look forward to theirs. The fundamental question before us is, how will COVID-19 change the Indo-Pacific? The truthful answer is a bit of a letdown. It is still too fresh and too early to forecast. Yet, we cannot get away with that. It is our duty as analysts to read the signs, understand developments, discern trends, and suggest or advocate policies that policymakers in the thick of events can find useful. How smartly we respond depends on how correctly we read the situation, as also how we shape it. We need analysis and strategy, and we need to get it right. So what can we, as citizens of the world and India, see in this half-light of a post-COVID night and day? First, it is clear that COVID-19 is an earth-shaking event that has cast a shadow on virtually every aspect of our life, not least life and death, everyday drills and habits, social interactions, livelihoods, and the economy. As a threat to life, even if the numbers of deaths may not be as large as yet, it has invoked parallels with the Spanish flu of 1918-19 and even the 14th century bubonic plague. Economically, it is already more widespread and much worse than the 2008-9 financial crisis, raising the specter of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Although one could argue that this crisis is not structural in nature and more epiphenomenal, and that the economies could rebound once the pandemic has peaked and recovered, and normal economies take shape. Geopolitically, it is reordering the China-West and especially the US-China relationship and threatening a new Cold War, though it is too early to predict who will come out on top. Given China's location at the heart of the very construct of the Indo-Pacific, going back to President Obama's pivot to Asia, and that the region is the theater of 3 major flashpoints involving China, the West and mainly China, the West mainly the US, and regional players, that is the South China Sea, East China Sea, and the North Pacific, and a 4th, if we include the unresolved India-China boundary, which has flared up again. It is logical that the region should be the first and likely strongest to feel its impact. Until recently, India was somewhat marginal to this construct, but global currents and eddies have brought us firmly into the concept, and we cannot avoid navigating its waters. I will try to address the subject in terms of its implications on geopolitics, geoeconomics, the region, and if we have time, India. First, as a pandemic, one thing is clear, that the international community's response to the crisis has been severely wanting. The WHO, the world body tasked and empowered to provide leadership on global pandemics, has been mired in controversy over its deference to China at a crucial stage. Lacking any leadership or support of major powers who find themselves at odds over the pandemic, the UN has played no role and stood on the sidelines. No major country, institution, or leader has come out unscathed, either in its handling of the pandemic or its reputation. All have been diminished. Faced with a global pandemic that respects no borders, the credo of my country first trumped international cooperation. The leaders of the international community have failed to craft a multilateral global response. Ironically, in spite of the failure of this, there are signs that the countries have not done well. Some, especially in the Indo-Pacific, such as South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Singapore, have been eminently successful in containing the pandemic and keeping fatalities down, as also Germany and most of Scandinavia, except Sweden, in Europe. In China, after the initial that also led to its threat to the rest of the world, has been contained, although through draconian measures. But resentment against China for its cover-up, lack of transparency, tutelage of the WHO at a crucial stage, attempts to obfuscate facts after the event, and aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy has spilled over into public opinion and geopolitics worldwide, earning the WHO-named COVID-19 the epithet, the Wuhan virus. I will just skip over the rest of the world. I think you all know its impact in Europe and other countries. But if I look at East and Southeast Asia as a whole, these regions have got away lightly, although they were very close to the pandemic and many share borders with China. An analysis of the numbers of deaths in 5 countries of the greater Mekong subregion and 5 countries of Europe worst hit by the virus in about mid-May by the Cambodian opposition leader Sam Rainsy in the Geopolitics revealed a figure of 0.2 deaths per million in the former, that is in the greater Mekong subregion, compared to 345 deaths per million in the latter. It actually is now closer to 500. Vietnam, a country of 97 million with close economic ties to China and 1 million tourists from China, has reported 0 deaths. So too, surprisingly, have Laos and Cambodia. Thailand is at 0.8 per million. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines stand between, and New Zealand and Australia stand between 3.5 to about 9. Japan and South Korea stand between 5 and 7. In South Asia too, despite rising numbers in India, figures of mortality on account of COVID-19 relative to population are far less than early predictions, but unfortunately rising. In India, as record numbers of new cases are reported every day, they have increased from about 2 million in mid-May to nearly 4 million on June 1. But in India too, there are some interesting variations. Though I do not have the latest figures, the incidence and mortality in the Northeast is much closer to the greater Mekong subregion than to the rest of India. If so, the study of the incidence of the virus in Yunnan province of China too would be worthy of study. Various hypotheses have been offered for the low incidence and mortality from COVID-19 in much of East, South, and Southeast Asia, ranging from geography, climate, demography, age structure, chronic diseases, vaccines, herd immunity, epidemiology, genetics, good public health systems in some cases, good governance, etc. These will, of course, have to be scientifically studied. But certain conclusions can be drawn even at this stage. First, that the basics of epidemiology, early action on border controls, quarantining, testing, tracing, monitoring, hygiene, distancing, public awareness raising, protective wear, sound public health systems, scientific approaches, ability to scale up treatment capacity, consultative administration, scientific approaches, required financial outlays, and good governance do matter, and where implemented have performed better than strongmen and charismatic leaders relying on instinct, public exhortations, and symbolism. Seen from this perspective, the short-term prognosis for India is not good. The combined effect of a total, sudden, extended, and nationwide lockdown, rising numbers of new cases, and a haphazard unlocking or relaxation under economic pressure suggests that the virus may take much longer to peak, with consequences for the poor and the economy that are likely to be as or more devastating than the virus itself. Second, that countries that have contained the virus faster and are already well plugged into the global economy, such as the Indo-Pacific economies, have the best chances of recovery and reap the benefits of any restructuring or relocation of global production and supply chains. They should be our economic partners of choice. In my previous lecture at the NIS on India-ASEAN at 25, I had offered a template for such a relationship, which may be relevant even now. And third, if it is indeed true that South and Southeast Asia may have common disease, immunological, epidemiological, and genetic features that may account for the relatively low incidence of the virus, it stands to reason that we should focus our quest for and research on drugs, treatments, and vaccines with the countries of the Indo-Pacific rather than the US and the West, as we seem to be doing. Thought also needs to be given to the IPR regime, the property rights regime under which the drugs and vaccines should be developed. Are we going to tend towards a nationalistic or a proprietary solutions. If indeed COVID-19 is a global pandemic, its treatments should also be developed as global public goods rather than proprietary technologies with suitable public funding. Turning to economics and geopolitics of the impact of COVID-19 on the Indo-Pacific, I would like to highlight a few things. The first lies in the differentials in the impact of and recovery from the pandemic and of the economy in the West and China. No doubt, China will be heavily impacted by disruptions in production and supply chains, transport and logistics, a slump in global demand and exports on which it depends, as also a negative reaction to China internationally. But given its early peaking and containment, its virulence in the West, China's efforts to boost domestic demand to compensate for falling exports, and signs of an early recovery, it seems to me that China holds the advantage in bouncing back. There are other problems, internal political tensions, as well as a debt overhang, but overall, on balance, it seems as though China has a better chance to come out quickly. The second is the China-West, especially China-US dynamics. This is clearly going southwards. This predated the novel coronavirus, but the Wuhan virus has definitely hastened the process, sharpened fault lines, and aggravated and exacerbated underlying contradictions to possibly a point where, at least under the current leadership in both countries, it is only likely to get worse. Trade wars are bound to intensify. Countries and companies hitherto doing business with China may hesitate. China is showing signs of retaliation, and Hong Kong may lose its special status as an economic entity. In fact, the whole idea of globalization that was conducted under an illusion that politics and economics could function in parallel, and there would be some convergence at some point in a kind of G2 that would include a token democratization of China in a second end of history, so to say, has been exposed, not just by President Trump's perception of the US-China relations as an inherently competitive one, but also the emotional tone that the relationship has taken after the mutual recriminations following COVID-19. A third related question is the relative rise, the secular decline, the relative rise of China and the secular decline of the US as an economic power, and the resultant changes in the global balance of power, resulting in a new world order. The conventional wisdom on this is that while China is no doubt rising and assertive, there is still a wide gap in, to use a Chinese term, comprehensive national power between the US and China. This is true. Yet in reality, China is able to use both its asymmetry and its lower comprehensive national power much more effectively than the US. The widespread protests against the police killing of George Floyd in Minnesota illustrates the unwieldy use of its power and the damage to its international image like little else, even as China gets away with much worse. It is also at the same time unrolling an alternative universe of initiatives and institutions, ranging from the BRI and AIIB to a parallel digital world and large corporations that aim to replace the Western world order with a Chinese-led order. At my previous lecture at the NIS, I had talked about a tricentric world, or balance of power between the US, China, and Russia, each acting in its own selfish interest rather than the larger good. COVID-19 may have tipped the balance in favor of China, but the story has far from ended. The factor that complicates this rise, my fourth point, is that unlike previous rising powers, COVID-19 has also exposed China as a sullen power. Its response to the international challenge posed by its role in the virus seems to be to sense a moment of opportunity. And here I'm answering Miles' question. Sense a moment of opportunity while the world is preoccupied with the pandemic to go on the offensive to settle its unfinished national agenda from Hong Kong to the South China Sea to India and possibly even Taiwan in the future. The idea of one country, two systems seems dead, as may also be the whole idea of a peaceful unification of Taiwan. In the process, it is raising concerns across a wide swathe of countries that found expression in even countries like Russia and Indonesia voting for the World Health Assembly resolution on an investigation into the pandemic. It has reacted to efforts to name, shame, and inquire into the virus with, as Ambassador Shyam Saran described in an article in the print yesterday, a mixture of hubris and acute insecurity. This is bound to invite a negative reaction. Finally, it raises the question of the impact of these latent tensions now brought to the fore on the entire ASEAN-led political, economic, and security architecture in the Asia-Pacific, the ASEAN summits, the East Asian Summit, the RCP, the ARF, the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea, etc. Once again, it is too early to say which way it will go. Certainly, ASEAN leaders will do their level best to keep each of these institutions active, inclusive, and relevant. But the effort will be testing, and a chill wind is likely to blow. Is this the time for the Quad, now expanded to the Quad Plus, to finally take shape? And if so, will it inaugurate a new Cold War? I probably don't have time to go into the India factor right now. I could perhaps come back to it at the Q&A. But let me just briefly say that in principle, India stands a lot to gain from this conjunction of affairs. But in actual fact, it is economically simply unprepared to do so. The rise of China is primarily an economic rise. Most of our responses tend to be military political. COVID-19 and the impact on its economy in India is only likely to aggravate it. There is, however, a window of opportunity in the Prime Minister's call for self-reliance and international cooperation simultaneously. If we are able to convert this call for self-reliance and international cooperation into a kind of move towards collective self-reliance and regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific amongst countries other than, let's say, China and the US. So I leave this with this thought. I thank you for your patience in listening to me, and I look forward to listening to the remaining analysis.